now is Arash Azizi. He is a PhD student at New York University. He's also the author of The Shadow Commander, which came out last year, end of last year. On February 8, 1971, Marxist revolutionaries attacked the police station outpost at the village of Siyahkal in Iran's Gilan province. Barely 2 months later, the Iranian People's Fada'i guerrilla officially announced their existence and began a long drawn out urban guerrilla war against the Shah's regime. In Call to Arms, Ali Rahnama provides uh, a comprehensive history of the Fada'is, and Arash will review the book and present his observations and understanding of Dr. Rahnama's presentation in the Call to Arms. Arash, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this great panel, and thanks for everybody for being here. So yeah, let's start here with talking a little bit about the history of Fada'is, and I can't help but I can't help but sort of having a short encounter of what Fada'i what the Fada'i history meant to people of my generation very briefly before I get to Dr. Rahnama's book. And I think very briefly matters because the historical preservance of Fada'is, I think, is at issue here. So I'm born in 1988, and when I was growing up in the years, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the crisis of the global left, for the generation of socialists and Marxists sort of grown up in Iran in in late high school and early university years, coinciding with the reign of President Khatami, who was a reformist, and obviously the liberal ideas sort of were very much in ascendancy. Fada'iyan had a very live present, and we had followed them very much. We knew the main arguments. The books were widely read. More interestingly enough, even more widely read than many leftist thinkers who had come in Iran in the years after the Fada'is. So, despite the defeat of the Fada'is before the revolution and the horrendous repression that all factions of the Fada'is suffered after the revolution and killing of many of their members and their conditions, they've had this they've remained very relevant for the left in Iran, and the history has remained relevant. So anybody who wants to study the history of Iranian left needs to answer the question of why is that, and why is the attraction and the continued relevance of the Fada'is. Now, when it comes to the academic studies of Iran, scholarly studies of Iran and Middle East in general, in the last few decades, if you pardon me for something of a generalization, one would say that studies of organizations and biographies is one of the general weaknesses. It is, at any rate, I think it's fair to say it's impossible to get for example, it's not really possible today to have a first book or a dissertation based on a biography of someone. It's very sort of unfashionable. And studies we still lack biographies of very major figures and organizations. If you compare this to, say, American history and European history, I mean, you have tons of you have tons of sort of biographical works on the main figures. But in Iran, let's say we have like one biography in English of Ayatollah Khomeini, obviously one of the most important figures on a global level of the 20th century. So on the Iranian organizations, in the last 20 years, when it comes to the left particularly, we had the excellent work by Ervan Abrahamian and Iranian Mujahideen. We had the volume by Maziar Behruz, a very influential volume in both International and Iran, which came out in 1994 and then 2000, and the rebels with the cause failure they left with Iran, and Matin Askar is a study of the Iranian Confederation of Students. And then in 2010, we had a book by sociologist Peyman Wahabzadeh on the Fada'is. So we can say that in the last 10 years, this book, Ali Rahnamaz, I'll also show it, and recommended very much at the outset, I should say. So in the last 10 years, we had these two books on Fada'is, and now we can say that the Fada'i movement is lucky enough in this sense to at least have two monographs. As I said, we are still, for example, there's still not a single monograph on the history of the Tudeh party as a whole in its long durée. Although there are obviously many works that touch on its different periods. Now, Professor Rahnamaz's book's major contribution is that he has very closely read the text and reconstructed the events, and that is very much at the center of his project, if you will. The attention to details and the attempt to reconstruct, the exact events, and by exact events I mean sometimes something as small as particular way of recruitment of certain members to the Fada'i guerrillas, or of particular incidences, whether inside the organization or in clashes with the Shah, are very much at the center of the book. It is also a close study of the main texts of the Fada'iyan, which we had also seen in Professor Wahabzadeh's work 10 years ago. I think I'll inevitably reference Wahabzadeh's work in relation to this as well. But the first chapters of the book, which I think are some of the strongest ones with Professor Rahnama, are where he goes methodically through Hassan Ziya Zarifi, Amir Parviz Puyan, Masroor Ahmadzadeh, Bijan Jazani, the four main theoretical references, if you will, of the Fada'iyan, and also the critique that they had of people like Jalal al-Ahmad, the Iranian intellectual at the time, and the Tudeh party. And he also closely has read responses by Tudeh party, like Fajrullah Mizani, the thinker of the Tudeh party, and it is of course a one would say generally sympathetic book about the Fada'is, and I'll get to some of the some of the issues that raises that this approach perhaps gives rise to. But first of all, the real contribution, as I said here, is the close reading of the text, the reconstruction of the events through really painstaking work of both really extensively looking at the extant documentations. Of course, many documents of Savak are still basically held by the Islamic Republic. They're not released, but many of them have been published in different forms, and it takes the artful intervention of a scholar to basically try to read against the grain, as we say, and try to figure out which evidence is more credible than the other. And this, as I said, very much is at the center of the current work, and as well as a serious reading of the texts, and not just sort of repeating what they're saying, but analyzing them in relation to the influences that they had and how they influenced others. The book starts also with a very sort of impassioned sort of defense, if you will, of the Fada'iyans, or explaining basically how they justified the armed struggle path that they picked. The book rhetorically compares the Fada'iyans to people who have sort of picked up arms to defend justice, from George Washington to George Orwell. And it's very much in this spirit. It is also in this spirit when it looks at the main internal differences of Fada'iyan. The differences that one could argue, although the book doesn't broach, later on led to the historic split of the Fada'i organization after the revolution into the majority and the minority. In analyzing the differences inside the book, inside Fada'iyan before the revolution, I think we get to some of the weaknesses of the book that I'd like to briefly discuss. So what's at issue here? At issue here is the question of how is it that a bunch of radical nationalists and leftists pick up arms and prioritize the armed struggle, as the title of Ahmadzadeh's famous pamphlet went, as both a strategy and tactic, and how this is criticized by the Tudeh party, but also actually internally critiqued at some point by one of the main figures of the Fada'iyan, and an iconic figure used by Fada'iyan throughout the years, Bijan Jazani. And how, as the book says, at the very after the killing of Hamid Ashraf, a sort of an iconic leader in '76, significant sections of the Fada'is themselves move away from the guerrilla struggle of the sort of urban guerrilla struggle, particularly that had been dominant before, and that was associated very much with Ahmadzadeh, as well as with foreign thinkers like Regis Debray, Carlos Marighella, and those who followed Carlos Marighella, Brazilian revolutionary, and those who followed sort of ideas of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Cuba. These differences after '76 leads to already a splits inside the Fada'i in many ways, even if they don't always develop into sort of actual splits, which really only happens after the revolution. Now, what are some of the weaknesses that I see here? I'll point to a few. I'll point to a few general points. Number one, it is fine that the book, unlike what it says at the end, it clearly does have a sympathy for the sort of mainline position of Fada'ians and Ahmadzadeh's particularly theory. It is absolutely fine to have the sympathy, or even perhaps is a sympathy sort of a scholar. But I think when it comes to assessing the ideas I'll raise two issues. So first of all, the chapter on general Marxist theory and the questions of violence and the role of individual action, I would generally describe as, obviously in a book like this, one doesn't expect a lot of time spent on a general chapter like this. But it matters here because it's not just a matter of how long it is, but it is one that is incomplete in its approach. The question of when and how to use violence and what is violence and who does it has of course involved the Marxist movement since forever. In Professor Rahnama's reading, it's not very clear, what picture of this intellectual history of Marxism in this regard that we get. It looks like there is a deterministic, there's a trend of thinking accused of being deterministic, and a trend of thinking that says no, we have to do something, and it becomes as simple as that. Of course, that's how proponents of the struggle in the 60s and 70s describe themselves, but they also were open about the fact that they weren't really interested in theoretical discussions, and at any rate, that's what led to Bijan Jazani's criticism of them. So with this account being thin, with this account of history of Marxism and armed struggle being thin, and in fact, frankly, misleading at parts, we get to then understanding of Bijan Jazani, who is seen as the divisive, and these are terms used in the book, as ultimately leading toward a deterministic approach again, as jockeying from prison for intellectual authority over the movement, as being lecturing the real guerrillas who were fighting in the field on Marxism, as having this obsession with the working class being important, that why is it that working class are not at the center of this strategy, and as being a so-called revolutionary come reformist. I mean, the immediate question that raises here is that well, it's not very strange for a Marxist organization to ask the question of wait a minute, this theory that revolutionary intellectuals are now the new vanguard, as Ahmadzadeh had proposed, does seem to be in contradiction with basic ideas of Marxism. And it's fine if one wants to depart from Marxism, but it's not very strange that some who had allegiances to Marxism, not just because they liked Marx, but because they believed that the centrality of the working class is important, would raise this. So it's a little strange to criticize Jazani here for being divisive, for having risen this. And in fact, I hope I'm being fair when, Jazani is also accused of being a bit rivalrous. It looks like Jazani is frankly portrayed a little bit as petty, if I may say. I think this also shows when Tudeh party's approach is critic, Tudeh party is portrayed as being closer to the regime than its opponents. It's portrayed as being effectively having the same position as the monarchists on the issue. That's how the Tudeh party's position is portrayed, and Jazani is of course portrayed as being closer to the party. The question that is raised here, doesn't matter what one's position is. I want to be clear on this, that in my humble opinion, it's not even a question of what takes one has or where one's sympathies is. But it's a question of why is it that a major part of the Fada'is, both before the revolution and then after the revolution, moved toward the Tudeh party, and why someone like Jazani had adopted these ideas that, according that I described as the book, and the book itself sees as closer to the party. Why would this happen? Why would a movement whose entire raison d'etre from the beginning had been opposition to the Tudeh party and to the so-called peaceful parliamentary way of struggle, however you want to describe it, why is it that they came to this criticism? And the book frankly doesn't seem to adopt this question, whereas it looks like to me that any study of the Fada'is would sort of need to talk about this, especially when we look at the course of the movement, what it actually occurred during its long years of armed struggle, and the course of the revolution later on. Couple of quick comments here. The book has a curious choice of ending its analysis in 76. It is justified in many ways because what Fada'is had started in a way comes to an end in 76, but obviously in a few years later, Fada'ian becomes a mass movement, one of the largest Marxist political parties existing anywhere in the history of the Middle East, actually, in the course of a few years, using the conditions of the revolution to grow up the way it did. And I don't think you can reproach any historian for finishing his answers at a certain point, but it does give rise to questions. This is also important because in Rahnama's analysis, the Fada'ian have a very critical role in the overthrow of the Shah's regime. He says that a long interacting chain reaction, and I quote, a long interacting chain reaction culminating in the overthrow of the Shah's regime happened by the Fada'ian. And what he calls, and he uses the word magic of the Fada'i movement, was that he was able to end the intimidation of the Pahlavi society. Now, I think that's a fascinating thesis, and it very much can be talked about. But it is also possible to at least countenance other possibilities and look at the fact that, well, after all, it was not the Fada'is, and it was not the armed struggle movement that did the ultimate work of overthrowing the regime, and that the mass movements which, as the book shows itself, very much the idea was that there is no condition for the mass movement, and this is why the Fada'is need to do the armed struggle. Is a mass movement that overthrew the regime. My time is coming to an end, so I'll just point quickly here that it's the same issue. If this by the reading that sees that sees Fada'is as having a very critical role in overthrow the Shah's regime, it means that the internal contradiction and debates of the Fada'i movement are not really addressed. And when Jazani is addressed, as I said, he's viewed a little unfairly, frankly. And this also, just in a form way, I would say that the book wouldn't be easiest to read for people not already a bit familiar with the history of modern Iran. It's amazing for a book from 64 to 76 that, for example, I don't think Ruhollah Khomeini's name is sort of mentioned once. I mean, I'm sure it's mentioned once at least, but really there's no view of the jungle, especially when we come toward the later period. Khomeini and the 1963 uprising is mentioned, but later on, of course, the presence of the Islamists, the different actions that sort of were going on in society, and the broader, the jungle and the trees question here, it's a little bit settled in favor of the trees. So which is linked to the issue of if you just look at the Fada'is, then it looks like they also had a very it looks like that the chain reaction did really lead to the overthrow of the Shah regime. But if you have a broader picture, then if you have a broader view of society, then different questions are raised here. I'll end with a couple of very sort of positive points in the good spirit, which is, I think when you want to talk about a book, you think it's boring if you just keep saying the things that you agree, the things that are good. So that might give to some sort of a critical thing. But very, very briefly, in less than a minute, I'll see some of the most positive things. The great work that the work of history can do is reconstruction, as I said, which the book has done excellent job in many points. And this even goes to small things. For example, the question of, we all know that Marighella or Regis Debray affected the Fada'is, but who bought books where, in what language did they read them, how did they get to the hands of people? These are discussed books in the book meticulously and very well. The question of how did Jazani and others write from inside the prison and got their writings out? How did they write on the back of the cigarettes? And the minute details of which are discussed, which for a historian, they're not sort of just cool facts, but I think do much to really show the particular ways in which it's very important, in my opinion, in intellectual history to look at the conditions in which the intellectuals were working, or how the crowds would gather around the newsstand and look at Kayhan and Etalad and the newspapers that were published. I think these are invaluable contributions to social history there, as well as the patience with which Professor Rahnama has dedicated, the patience with which he has looked into some of the, for those of us who are also sort of members of the left and different parties are familiar with some of the internal questions about, what exactly happened there. And he has looked at many different sources, and no matter whether one accepts his version or not, the work is clear, the sources are clear, and the book would be invaluable to anyone who wants to ever write on the Fada'is, frankly, from now till many years later. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope we can have more discussion later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arash. And again, I apologize for the video problem that we had, but at the end, I will rerun that. Now we kind of fixed the issue of echoing, and if people are interested, we will rerun Professor Abrahamian's talk from a previous seminar. Our next speaker is Rasmus Elling. Professor Elling is a professor of urbanism and modern Middle East at University of Copenhagen. His talk is titled as From the City to the Mountain, Urban and Ethnic Questions about Fada'i History. The talk will briefly outline Dr. Elling's recent research on the global 1979 revolution in Iran. He analyzes Fada'i writings and activities from the urban-centered perspective, urbanization, urban consciousness, urban culture, urban guerrilla tactics. In the process, he will shed more light on the relation between urbanization in the broader sense of Iran in the 70s and the specific history of the Fada'i movement. Then he will raise a few questions about the relation between the Fada'i movement and the issue of ethnicity and nationality, and will carry out comparative and global microhistory research on the Iranian and Palestinian radical left movement of the 70s and 80s. Rasmus, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Durud bar shoma. I hope you can all hear me. Sending live from a very improvised space in a tiny cottage in Denmark, where it's now very close to my kids' bedtime. So if you hear some noise from the children, I apologize. I'm very honored and pleased to have been invited. I'm slightly intimidated also because, unlike the esteemed panelists here, I came fairly recently to this topic of the Fada'i movement. I came to this topic, as already indicated in Mr. Iqtidari's introductory remarks, through questions of urbanism and urbanization. And I will try to outline some of my recent research and then raise a couple of questions. I know I will learn a lot today from my fellow panelists and hopefully also from discussions later. One of the issues that has interested me a lot is this issue of the Iranian Revolution in '79 as an urban phenomenon. There seems to be a consensus among historians that, for quite obvious reasons, the Iranian Revolution in '79 can be considered an urban revolution in the sense that it was driven by urban-centered protests by urban classes of people. But to deepen our understanding of the urban nature of that revolution and the movements preceding it, I raised the issue of what was urban about the urban guerrilla, the quintessential urban guerrilla of the 1970s, namely the Fada'i movement. I examined a broad range of materials from and about the Fada'is, underground pamphlets, organization newsletters, intra-group debates, theoretical writings, biographies, autobiographies, and I tried to pinpoint 4 analytical attention points connected to the urban, understood here in its broadest sense as a range of social, material, and ideological phenomena intertwined with urbanization. The first point that I focused on is the issue of the urban as central to the historical context. I argue that the rapid urbanization...
Pardon me, Rasmus. Can you get closer to microphone? Apparently, some people have problem hearing you.
I will try, and I will also try to speak louder.
Thank you.
The first argument goes that Iran's rapid urbanization in the 1960s and 70s facilitated the emergence of the Fada'is and shaped their thinking. This, of course, stands in contrast to the heavily naturalistic aesthetics, mythology, and cultural production associated with particularly the Siyahkal resurrection, in which the guerrillas were often portrayed and associated with Jangal, the forest, and coup, the mountains, and even with particular flowers and animals. But in reality, most of the cadres, the leading cadres of the Fada'i movement, were generally very urban in their profile, and the material conditions that made underground political activism and then guerrilla warfare possible, I argue in this paper, were associated with urbanization. So urban centers, universities, printing presses, factories, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the urban was a central feature of the historical context of the emergence of the Fada'is. Secondly, I explore how urbanization, both in socio-economic and in cultural terms, was treated analytically in the Fada'i analysis, strategy, and theory writing. Very prolific text production. And I particularly look at how the so-called White Revolution, the top-down land reforms by the Shah, acted as a catalyst for structural transformation from feudalism to dependent capitalism, how this is treated in the Fada'i literature. So how urbanization is connected to larger structures of repressive modernization and industrialization under aristocratic elite and comprador bourgeoisie, aligned with Western imperialism. This led to, among other things, breakneck rural to urban migration and the emergence of an urban subproletariat that I will come back to later. But there was also a focus on the urbanization of consciousness, so to speak. So urban culture of protest in the middle of police state conditions was very central in this analysis. Third, I look at how the urban functioned as a setting and resource for armed revolutionary struggle. Particularly, I explore how the Fada'is developed a guerrilla urbanology, a shahrshanasia chariki. So this is a subversive epistemology of the urban as a setting and resource for armed struggle. And in underground pamphlets and manuals, the Fada'is were told how to map and study urban landscapes, learn about reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, safe house logistics, encoding of intra-cadre communication, evasion, shadowing, and other practical matters pertaining to urban space, on top of organizational questions of chain of command and personal questions of morale, physical training, disguise, and so on. But I also argue that this was a larger issue in a doctrine that one could call in a forest of humans, and I'm paraphrasing Bijan Jazani's very evocative metaphor for the city as a jangale insan ha. The Fada'is utilized urban space as a theater for armed propaganda, spectacular attacks that would undermine the state's image as unassailable, almighty, and all-seeing. These acts were then recorded and distributed in pamphlets, publications with hand-drawn maps and even hand-drawn scenes from the revolutionary deed itself, and there's an example on my slide here, all to bolster this mythology of the urban guerrilla, a vanguard protagonist. And then fourth and finally in this study, I look at how the Fada'is produced fieldwork reports from visits and engagement with the shanty towns of Tehran, the so-called Halabi Abad, where Fada'is would go and embed themselves, or at least ask questions of the locals, trying to locate and understand the emergence of the urban subproletariat, the Olonak Nishinan, Chador Nishinan, Gold Nishinan, Hashir Nishinan. A possible agent of revolutionary change was identified in the Kharij az Mahdude, on the outskirts of the metropole. So this struggle that they identify in the shanty towns is against authorities at repeated attempts to evict the shantytown people who have arrived, uprooted by the land reforms, and arrived as rural migrants in Tehran and other big cities in Iran. The struggle against state-led authoritarian gentrification pointed to a new left understanding, not unlike that of Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher who slightly earlier, but around the same time, theorized the idea of the right to the city, not just about a right to housing, but a right to freedom and a right to change your own destiny in a heavily urbanizing environment of authoritarianism. So the Fada'is at this point were flirting with this idea that the urban sub-proletariat mobilizations were revolutionary embryos, a potential as big as or maybe even bigger than that of factory workers. So to sum up, the Fada'is had a contradictory or complex view of the urban, obviously, because it's a complex phenomenon, as both the scene of authoritarian repression, police state surveillance, and subjugation to a dominant bourgeois culture, entangled as it is in global capitalism and imperialism, but also the urban as a site of new forms of solidarity, resistance, emancipatory potentials. So I hope to have shown with this piece of research how adopting an urban analysis can contribute with new historical knowledge. This knowledge, I think, should be placed within a global history of the New Left and revolutionary third worldism, because it strikes me again and again during this research how the Fada'is tended to connect urban and very local, particular specific questions in Iran in the light of or the context of global questions of imperialism, capitalism, and power. In effect, urban analysis, I argue, was used to bridge the universalist prescriptions of Marxist and revolutionary theory with the local particular conditions of the Fada'i's own national liberation struggle in Iran. So sometimes urban and rural facts were used to debate and position the Iranian struggle vis-a-vis other Marxist and third worldist struggles and revolutionary experiences, be they the Russian, Chinese, Cuban, and Algerian, Palestinian, and various South American experiences with revolution. And then to settle, and this is important, to settle on what the Fada'is perceived to be an appropriate Iran-specific praxis. At other times, there were concrete cases of urban struggle invoked in Fada'i writings and activism to raise awareness about how everyday life is shaped by the contradictions of capitalism and by imperialist exploitation. But one of the arguments I really wanted to push in this research was that, and I would love to work more on this and hear your feedback on this, rather than seeing the Fada'is as recipients of Western or global theories of revolutionary change, they in fact produced their own analyses based on local historical facts. And an example of this would be that already in the mid-1960s, I argue, and this is well before the Fada'is have read translations of Carlos Marighell's famous work positioning guerrilla, the urban guerrilla ahead of the Cuban blueprint for revolution through rural Foucault-style guerrilla uprisings as the befitting case for Iran. So the Fada'is had already sort of more or less settled on that idea, even though there was still a temptation to flirt with the idea of a rural insurrection, as we saw most famously, of course, at the starting point of the guerrilla movement with the Siyahkal attack. But there was a consensus most of the time, and not among all the thinkers, that the armed struggle would have to be centered on urban spaces. And this is quite interesting, and it can help us discuss sort of the idea of circulations of revolutionary and third worldist ideas around the world and how they interact with each other. So as a next step, as Mr. Echtedori also mentioned, is that we just launched a new project together with Sune Haugbølle, who is a professor at Roskilde University, entitled 1979 and the End of Third Worldism in the Middle East. It's a comparative global micro-history project on the New Left and Third Worldist revolutionary movements in Palestine and Iran. What I would like to do personally for that project actually goes back to my earlier research, which is on ethnicity, minorities, and nationalism in Iran. My first book was about this issue of ethnic minorities in Iran, and I would like to return to this issue, but from another angle. I would like to understand in my own sub-project of this larger project, how did the Fada'is view the national question when it came to ethnic minorities and their aspirations for autonomy, which is one of the many reasons I'm very excited to hear some of our other panelists today. Because I believe I hope we will touch upon this hugely important and somewhat understudied chapter of Fada'i history, namely the fighting in Turkmen Sahara and in Kurdistan. A related and also understudied topic that I hope someone, maybe I will, but I hope more work will be done on this, is how did Fada'is understand Iran in its complex entirety? The peripheries, the rural areas, the agrarian question, nomads, and so on and so forth. So I hope by shifting between an urban and a peripheral focus, just as the Fada'is moved from the mountains and forest to the city and then back to the mountains and the plains after the Khomeinist power consolidation or during, I hope to contribute or try to understand more about questions concerning this relationship between the global and the local in national liberation struggles. So the different scales of the urban, the peripheral, and the global in third worldist thinking generally, and comparatively speaking, I hope something can be done here on Palestine, and then specifically, of course, in Iranian history. This national liberation struggle, I believe, is also about tying together or working across geographical, socio-economic, demographic, cultural centers and peripheries. And the co-production of these different scales is key, I believe, to a more nuanced historical understanding of these important and often misunderstood movements of the 1970s. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rasmus. Appreciate it. Now we're going to, let me get my camera back. So we're going to Siyavush Ranjbar Daimi. Dr. Ranjbar is a lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's the author of The Quest for Authority in Iran. The title of this talk is The Fada'i Movement and the Iranian Revolution, 1977 to 79. The talk will provide an overview of the main elements of the Fada'i movement's reaction and participation to the unfolding revolutionary events in Iran between 1977 and 79, based on the movement's written output of the time and interviews with surviving cadres and leaders. The talk will discuss the extent to which the Fada'i participated in the various stages of the revolution. The talk will conclude with focus on the event of February 1979, when the Fada'i movement organized the first public meeting of the left in Iran since the August 53 coup against Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. Siyavush, this is yours.
Thanks very much, Kudas, and thank you very much for organizing this event. It's great to be here with everybody else. So my research really revolves around my own project and my own research on the Iranian Revolution, which is really looking at the role that movements which did not move on to assume state power after the revolution had in the revolutionary process. And histories of the revolution usually focus, of course, on the eventual winners, on the religious front, on the losers, on the Shah, the US administration, and the Khomeini faction and more, but we still do not have a full explanation as to what certain groups actually did in that period. And one of these groups is, of course, the Fada'i movement. As mentioned earlier, Ali Rahnama's book ends with 1976, with the moment in which the undisputed leader of the Fada'is, Hamid Ashraf, is killed in his hideout in Mehrabad Junubi area of Tehran, together with around a dozen other members of the Fada'i top brass. And that is really a very large, but very big body blow that sort of hits the Fada'i movement. And from that moment onwards, the main issue becomes ensuring survival and preventing a complete eradication of the Fada'i movement. And this is actually what happens. The Fada'i movement is one of the few, if not the only, major radical group that actually manages to conduct an existence outside prison and inside the country between 1977 and 79. In stark opposition to, for example, the Muslim wing of the Mujahideen Khalq movement, which in this period becomes practically dormant outside prison and survives by virtue of its leaders, Musa Khiyabani and Masoud Rajavi, primarily being in prison and being discharged from jail by January of 1979, and then coming back and only then really restarting their political activities. But the Fada'is were different. And we have proof of this by, for example, the very extensive set of communiques that the Fada'i movement kept producing after Hamid Ashraf's death, produced inside the country in a clandestine way, which, for example, reported on the continued armed activity, the bombing of government buildings, the occasional Edamhay Inqilabi, the revolutionary executions of figures associated to the regime, and more, which went on all the way to February 1979. So that's one track of the Fada'i activities. But the others also has a lot to do with internal discussions as to what the trajectory of the movement was after the killing of Hamid Ashraf, and the start of this protracted debate, for example, on whether the country had reached what was called in Fada'i terminology the Sharayet Eini Inqilab, the objective conditions of revolution. And during these debates, there is within the leadership which emerges after Hamid Ashraf, which eventually coalesces on a three-person collective leadership by the Fada'is Hadi, Mansour, and Majid. Majid is the only one that's currently alive of these three. There is a drift towards endorsing the position, the thought of Bijan Jazani that was mentioned earlier, and moving away from Masoud Ahmadzade's position. And this sort of process, however, did have friction at both ends. For example, the group based abroad of Ashraf Dehqani and Muhammad Hormatipur, they started to their steadfast loyalty to the Ahmadzadeh position would be effectively the cause of a very early split away from the Fada'i movement in the spring of 1979. And within jail, within the considerable amount of cadres that were in jail all the way until the January 1979, there was a detachment from the whole idea of armed struggle. And for example, at the end of that process, we have the emergence of groups such as Rah Kargar after the revolution. So if you look at the Fada'i publications at the time, from the third issue of Payam Daneshju through to the summer of 1978, you have this evolution of the position as to whether we have finally met the Shariyat Eini Inqilab in Iran or not. So from November 1976, a few months after the killing of Hamid Ashraf on Hasht Tir, which is, I think, in July, communique writing resumes with a sum up of where the Fada'i movement is, blaming, for example, phone tapping on the killing of Ashraf, and saying that the Fada'is had reached a degree of stability and were sort of consolidating before all these killings. Then there is a traditional message to the students on the occasion of 16 Azar, the 16th of Azar, the University Student Day in Iran, And then there is a hiatus in publication of these communiques all the way until October of 1977, when there's a detailed communique that focuses on the housing issue Rasmus just mentioned now. At that point in time, the Kharij as Mahdoude issue, the issue of the shanty towns built outside authorization, outside the precinct of cities, was a very serious social phenomenon. That it had even resulted in a few of these slum dwellers being killed in the course of clashes. So that's a communique which really deals with this issue in a central way. Now, at the end of 1977, a very important process which occurs in actually throughout 1977, which would be important for the Fada'i movement, is what became known by what was defined by the prisoners, Fada'i and others in jail, as Jimmy Kerossi. The policy of the policies that Carter was sort of pressuring the new Carter administration was pressuring the Shah to implement. And this also meant that not only there was a bit more space for non-violent dissidents to write letters, to start being active again after their activity being mothballed for years, such as the National Front, but also brought an end to the Mellikeshi practice, which was basically the indefinite detention of prisoners after the end of their sentencing. And this was important for many Fada'i cadres and many sympathizers of the Fada'i movement who were arrested maybe in the late 60s and sentenced to around a decade of jail. And in 1977, we have the end of the prison term of a considerable amount of people. And by the summer and autumn of 1977, they come out of jail and they start participating in this sort of renewed civil society activities. And they start also establishing ties with Sazman, despite not engaging straight away in clandestine activities. And the universities flare up. It is in that period that universities flare up and they become a focal point of societal support for the Fada'is. And some of the booklets that actually Erasmus showed earlier in his slides are distributed and are read for the first time by university students within campus. So the way it worked is that these pamphlets would be opened page by page. They would be put on blankets so they could quickly be wrapped up and taken away if security forces would arrive, and people would take turns within the university campus to just go through one page at a time in a queue. So the universities would remain the bedrock of support for the Fada'is. However, this didn't mean that the Fada'is were reacting in a positive way to whatever was happening. For example, if you look at the way the Goethenites, the reaction of the Fada'i movement, at least the clandestine leadership to the Goethenites, that was different from the rank and file and the supporters. The supporters went there. They were amongst the thousands that went to the Goethe Institute during those 10 famous nights. There were a lot of pamphlets produced by supporters regarding the martyrs of the Fada'is that was passed hand to hand. Majid told me that he went there one of the nights and suddenly was passed this material which was being shared around, and he was rather surprised by it. There were some Fada'i cadres who had just come out of jail, some prominent public figures who had contacts with the Sazman like Ali Keshkar that took part, but the Fada'i organization did not release a communique, did not focus on the Goethenites as other groups did. For example, the Sazman Enqilabi in Exile was far more interested in the Goethenites than the Fada'is were. So this was a bit of a missed opportunity to really get into that, but other events, other follow-up events, such as a famous one at Ari Omer University, where Beazin was supposed to talk, and it ended with a considerable amount of violence, that was taken more seriously. So, as we know, conventionally, our idea of the revolution starts with January 1978. That's when the famous Rashidi Mutlaq article is published, and the GOM and the Qom violence occurs shortly thereafter. In the communique that the Fada'is produced on Qom, it is quite interesting because the Qom fallen are associated with the Siyahkal ones, and there is a sort of a idea that you know, these events are all in a continuum of the struggle against the Shah. And this is very different from actually what the reaction of the religious forces were to Siyahkal. That was a very neutral and a non-committal one, actually, back in 1971. Progressively, at every key juncture, every key famous juncture of the revolution, there is some form of communique that is let out, and there is support for all this. However, by April or May, the first discussions were taking place within the clandestine leadership as to whether this first round of revolutionary activity was finally, you know, matching the شرایط عینی انقلابی. And there was no consensus still on this front. But however, this would come in August before the famous Cinema Rex attack in Abadan. And it would come in the form of a booklet called the وظایف اساسی مبارزان. And this was one of the first, I would say, very early on, analysis to claim that what we are seeing in Iran right now is a full-blown revolution. And there's a mention of the revolution middle classes, and there is this claim that there needs to be a shift towards political work, kar siyasi, rather than just engaging in armed mobilization as the first sort of first and foremost way of meeting the situation. So it is from then that early discussions about the creation of an overt political organization, which was to be called Pishgam, form. Mehdi Fatehpur was at the forefront of it, and there was the aspiration to involve people who were not necessarily Fada'is. For example, Beazin, who was the ranking Tudeh intellectual inside the country. Then people like Abbas Samakar, Saeed Rahnama, Reza Allamezadeh, all prominent figures from academia as well. And as you see from the arts, many of them are still alive and have moved on to be actually prominent academics or filmmakers. So the idea was to create a broad front for political work. And the people behind this were the cadres who came out of jail from in 1977 and others. At this time, some of these freed cadres start to actually enter into clandestine life, and they start to be active in the communique writing. And following the severe rioting of the 8th of November, if I'm not wrong, 15 Aban, which followed Taleghani, Ayatollah Taleghani's release from prison, Farrokh Negahdar, who from then onwards will become one of the important communique writers, writes, is the main author of a famous communique, which is known with the last sentence, Qiyam ra bavar konim, and it is the start of the Fada'iyans sort of urging sympathizers and more to take part actively in the rallies as well. And there is an attempt to organize a separate Fada'i queue in the rallies. It's not always successful because of the number of people involved. I remember at this point in time, the Fada'is still are a clandestine organization of around 20 people or less at its core leadership. Between the months of December and January, we have the last sets of political prisoners that are freed from jail. And people like Mehdi Sameh and Roghiyeh Daneshkari, they have triumphal returns to their hometowns. Mehdi Sameh goes to Isfahan, Roghiyeh Daneshkari goes to Tabriz. These people were in jail for years. They were a bit distant from what was going on within society, but people form long queues to see them in their living rooms and ask them for political analysis, which they had none to offer, really. And these people start acting with the martyrs' family. They engage in photo exhibitions of the martyrs, which become a fixture around the big cities. And they play an important role in the Fada'i PR offensive. They liaise with the press, pass on the communiques. The moment when the Shah leaves, Sameh, for example, is in the Outtlawed newspaper office reading the communique produced regarding that. And it is in this milieu that an important letter to Khomeini was released a couple of days after the Shah leaves Iran, but still before Khomeini returns. This again was written by Farrokh Nigahdar. People interested in the English version and have access to the Merip archive can read the full translation of it, I think in issue 76, if I'm not wrong, of Merip Reports. It was written by Farrokh Nigahdar, and it contains some warnings. And it says, addressed to Khomeini, if your understanding of the Islamic Sharia and the Islamic movement means persistence in the anti-imperialist and the anti-dictatorial struggle, we admire such an understanding. However, if on the contrary, the purpose of appealing to Islam and its teachings is the repressing of every opposing thought, form of an opinion, the chaining of thought and revival of an inquisition and instruments of repression, the revival of the slogan Hez Fagad Hezbollah, and the muffling of every freedom-seeking voice under the pretext of defending the Quran and the Sharia, then we will oppose it. And we will see how this letter wasn't really heeded a bit later on when Khomeini comes. On the day in which Khomeini returns, the Fada'is gather at a certain street corner to form their own sort of reception crowd, but they were obviously submerged by these very large crowds that you probably have all seen in footage, or maybe have actually been there that day. So I'll finish now with a mention of the demo which took place on Nuzday Bahman. This is the 8th of February, 3 days before the success of the revolution. This was the first ever public demo of the demonstration meeting of the Fada'is, and the first meeting, independent meeting of the left in Iran since August 16, 1953, since the days of the August 1953 coup against Mohammad Mossadegh. It was the first ever, therefore, in around 26 years. And the occasion is clear. It was the anniversary of the Siyahkal uprising. The idea was to hold the meetings on the ground of Tehran University and then march in surrounding streets. The program and the meeting were advertised by way of handbills stuck around the university the preceding day. And the university was a hubbub at that point of revolutionary activity, as you can imagine. Plans were suddenly thrown in the air by news that the demonstration in support of Bazargan was planned for that day. But still, the meeting was held on the 19th of Bahman inside the grounds. Despite the fact that there was an attempt at disruption by the organizers of the pro-Bazargan meeting, anybody trying to enter the grounds of Tehran University would be met by people who would tell them that the clergy does not have a demonstration inside Tehran University today. Nevertheless, thousands attended that rally, and the program concluded by a resolution which was read out by Mehdi Sameh, and this resolution will be published actually in the new upcoming second edition of Rah Digar, which will be published, a compilation edited by Turaj Atabaki and Nasser Mohajer, that will be published in Persian hopefully in a few weeks' time. This was produced by another leading member of the Fada'i, Jamshid Tahiripur, and deals with the initial request of the Fada'iyan. It contains an unconditional acceptance of Khomeini's leadership. Evidently, the way he came back to the country made many of the points raised in that open letter moot. And it was mostly negatory. So there was talk about the abolition of the army, abolition of certain elements of the bureaucracy, but there was no real concrete proposal as to what the shape and form of the future state system should be. So the Fada'ians did not have a blueprint regarding what they should replace in what way should the falling monarchy be replaced with what form of a republic? Federal one, central one, a presidential one, whatever. However, these proposals also mark one of the very early proposals in this way, certainly by the left. At that point in time, we don't have much from the Tudeh or the Mujahideen Khalq or anybody else. So it's one of the early actually proposals, even though it's mostly about of abolishing parts of the ancien regime rather than exactly what should come in its place. So 2 days later, on the 10th of February, finally the demonstration takes place, actually the march. Tens of thousands take part. The idea was initially to march towards the Shahyad, or as it was already called, Azadi Square. However, the march proceeds in the other way along what was Shah Reza Avenue, I think it's Engelab now, because the news was coming of the Homa Farah mutiny. And the march only gets to Ferdowsi Square. Famously, there is this claim that when the head of the demo gets to Ferdowsi Square, the beginning was still within the grounds of Tehran University. But it is disbanded there in order for everyone to make their way to East Tehran and go and support the Homa Farah mutiny. And on the 11th of February, the following day, the Fada'is are fanned across town. They take part as everybody else in the assault on the remaining strongholds of the regime. The crowds were armed by that point in time. There was no specific Fada'i brigade that was engaging in a specific operation, specific part of town, from what I know. However, a leading member, Qasim Siyadati, is killed while assaulting the radio headquarters in Ark Square. At the same time, however, the Fada'i organization gets hold of the technical faculty of Tehran University, and the following morning, a communique read out by the radio, which was reveling in freedom during those hours, tells everybody that the faculty is now the Mahal Tajammu, or meeting point for members and supporters of the Fada'i. So it was in this moment that you can say that the Fada'i movement actually defeated what Savak tried to do all along, and which was to extinguish it. And it is in this moment, on the 12th of February, that you see that the Fada'is managed to survive the first 8 years of systematic repression by Savak. And of course, however, that would be the start of the many divisions that we see after the revolution. So the Fada'is enter the new era by praising select elements of the revolutionary front. The Mujahideen Khalq and Taleghani in particular get a mention, but not the moderate ones, not the Nizat Azadi, not the Jabhe Milli, or many other elements of the clergy. Of course, Khomeini also is praised. Asks people to build headquarters everywhere, but is an organization which is still rather unknown. And I'll finish with this vignette of Majid, one of the three members of the three-person top leadership council that finally emerges, like many others, from clandestine living pretty much on the day after the fall of the regime, makes his way to the technical faculty to join everybody else, and is stopped on his tracks by the new security that the Fada'is, that the Fada'i supporters had put around Technical University, and nobody knew him, of course, because he was a clandestine figure. And in order to prove that he was really a Fada'i, he had to show his grenades with Sazman Cherikay Fada'i Khalq written on it. And this, of course, gives you also the idea of the fact that such an organization could not really mobilize to the level that, for example, the clergy with all their overt personalities and overt structures could do. So the very fact that tens of thousands turned out in the 19th of Bahman demo and the 10th of February march helps us understand the extent to which the Fada'i sort of myth also, and particularly the myth of the Fada'i martyrs. At that point in time, only the Fada'is and the Mujahideen really had martyrs, was effective in ensuring that they would have considerable support at the moment of the revolution's success. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Siyavush, for your brief I want to mention that if there are any questions regarding the speakers, we will have 20 to 30 minutes of QA at the end. And you can write your question at the QA down below your screen, and we will get to those questions. And now, the last but not the least is Yasamin Meidar. As I said, this chronology is based on the time of the event that the speakers are going to talk about. And Yasamin is going to talk about her personal experience. She is a SCR member of St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford, and editor of Critique, Journal of Socialist Theory. She's also the author of Women and Social Revolution. And she'll be talking about her personal observation with the minority Fada'i movement in Iranian Kurdistan. She was initially she started as a candidate member and then later became a member of the Fada'i minority. And she stayed in two villages, Baghche and Piranshah, in Iranian Kurdistan. And it's based on her diary of events from 81 to 1983. And she'll try to draw some conclusion regarding the organization's political direction, attitude to women Peshmergas, as well as interactions with peasants in both villages. Yasamin, it's yours.
Thanks very much, Budaz. I'm going to pick up where Siyabush finished, really, which is the immediately after the revolution, but also what he alluded at, the many divisions within the Fada'i after the revolution. I think the most important was probably, in my opinion, definitely, but for some probably, the minority-majority split. The reason I mentioned this is mainly because this, amongst the many hundreds of splits that the left in Iran has had since 1979, this is probably one of the more clear-cut ones. It was a division between those who wanted a critical support for the Islamic Republic, who saw the new government moving towards the socialist camp, and those who called for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. So it was a very, if you like, open, clear division. And I think what is important here is that a lot of the history of that split and later on has been forgotten, partly because of so many people who died, so many people who were in prison, but also the fact that very few people want to talk about it. Defeat is not something people want to talk much about. I will start with a large number of security setbacks that minority faced between 1980 and 81, culminating probably in spring of 1981, when basically important members of the leadership were arrested, killed, they subsequently killed themselves or were killed during a process. And that led to the organization making a conscious decision to move its cadres and the Central Committee to Kurdistan. I think by then it was the only place they could go. Turkmen Sahra was not an option anymore. Khomeini had declared war on the people of Kurdistan, so you had a more positive local population. What is important about this, and what very few people talk about, is the gender difference that this whole move to Kurdistan, this transfer of power from Tehran to Kurdistan or major Iranian cities to Kurdistan meant for the Fada'i. For the first time, women had to take positions of authority. Ironically, it was the hijab of the Islamic Republic, the enforced hijab by then, that allowed this movement of women in positions of authority within the organization to be able to be the contact between Kurdistan, which had by then become the location, the place where the organization existed, and major Iranian cities. So the authority for Tehran Workers' Committee, quite a responsible post, was handed to Nastaran, a woman. The editor of the newspaper Kar was Masoura Ahmadzadeh. She had held that position, but she was one of the few who could travel between Tehran and Kurdistan, easily hidden under layers of headscarf. I believe she even at times covered her nose and mouth with a magnae. Why was this possible? Well, the travel between Kurdistan and Iranian cities was on bus from major cities, mainly Tehran, but also Tabriz, Hamadan, other places, and then to Mahabad, Miane, Bukhara, major cities, and then from there on minibus. Now, from the minibus journey was the dangerous part of this journey, because you had a very large number of checkpoints organized by Revolutionary Guards who would stop the minibus and ask people who they were. They had this photo of various people they were looking for. High amongst them was Masture, but also other people they were looking for. And the way this happened was the way you could hide your identity, as I said, was with the hijab. However, it still was a very dangerous step each way. When you went through these checkpoints on the minibus, it was really a very dangerous position. The way the situation worked was then that the political decisions were made by meetings in Kurdistan, by larger gatherings, not very large, but larger than what you could have in Tehran. A couple of plenums where members came from all over the country to Kurdistan and then went back. Or in the case of men, very often didn't go back. They stayed in Kurdistan. It was the safer place to be. I'm going to talk about Baghche. Baghche was the main base of the Fada'i in Kurdistan. It wasn't the only one, but it was one of the main ones. I wasn't involved in the discussions with the peasantry on how they managed to stay in this village. But my guess is that someone like Bijan, that Siyavush mentioned, or other people went with groups of Kurds, because you did need Kurdish speakers for this purpose, negotiated with the peasantry, and came to some kind of agreement. It was dangerous for the peasants to allow the Fada'i to stay there, so we can't underestimate the dangers that that could have posed for them. My recollection of the place and what I have, both from memory and what I've written, is a village very similar to, if you have visited ever Western Azerbaijan in Iran. In terms of Kurdish villages, it has more similar to Western Azerbaijan villages as opposed to what I would call more mountainous Kurdish villages, where the village is actually built on the slopes of a mountain. So one house's rooftop is the garden of the other house. Baghche isn't like that. It's on the slopes. It's in a valley next to a mountain, but it's on a flat surface. One of the main attractions of Bakhsh, as far as I could see, was the fact that it was a bigger village and it had a school. It had a large school. The school became the center of the base. This is where the larger rooms were used as both dormitories. One of the larger rooms was used for dining room and also for political meetings. The smaller rooms, which were classrooms, were either used as bedrooms. For example, women had one room where, because we were fewer, we had one bedroom. But the courtyard and the larger halls could be used for larger political meetings. The village had a mosque, and in the long tradition of the Fada'is, martyrs were very important. Their death was very important. One of the academics I know in Oxford has written a lot about the anthropology of the revolutionary movements, and it's certainly true that the Fada'is kept the traditions of Shia religion. So none of us was important until we died. At least that was the concept in the Fada'i. None of us almost existed until we died. But the main role of the mosque was to commemorate the martyrs, both those who had died a very long time ago, Siyahkal, 1981, but also those who died, those comrades we knew who went to fight and died in battle in Kurdistan itself. So the mosque was quite busy. We had regular, if you like, ceremonies there. The cleric who was there was very liberal. He seemed to be a follower of Mullah Hassani, who, as some of you know, was called the Red Mullah in Kurdistan. So he allowed the International to be sung in his mosque. He allowed us to bury comrades and commemorate them 7 days after their death. I don't remember the 40 days, but I'm pretty sure we also had something near a month for the dead. And we had quite a lot of them. The saddest and the worst one, probably the death of 6 comrades who died at the same, in one battle, when they went to, when they were caught in what is called Kamin, i.e. the Revolutionary Guards had set up a trap and they all died on that occasions. A lot has been said and written about the Fada'i's relations with Siyahkal peasants. As you know, it wasn't very positive. At least the Shah's regime managed to portray the peasants as people who opposed the Siyahkal movement and actually gave names to the government. The relationship with the peasants in Kurdistan was obviously much more positive. There are good reasons for it. The Kurdish population was in itself a very pro-revolution, pro-left population. I think there were some tensions in terms of the use of the school, the fact that there were lots of armed people on the village. And if I understand correctly, the peasants in that village paid quite heavily for hosting or being hosts to left-wing organization after the Fada'is had to leave and go further nearer the Iraqi border and eventually into Iraq. The peasant women were very interesting. They kept bringing those of us who were of a female gender, long skirts, nice dresses. They kept telling us we don't have to wear these silly trousers. They were very worried that we were in Peshmerga clothes, which I can understand. It didn't look very nice. And we all, as women, wore headscarves. There was a lot of debate about the issue of headscarf, because obviously as left-wingers, we thought we shouldn't be wearing them. The explanation from the organization and the Central Committee was that the peasants were very concerned about communists and women and all the rest of it, and wearing a headscarf, having a separate quarters for sleeping across the courtyard of the main base made the situation more positive. I.e., they didn't consider us to be flouting religious rules, and the headscarf helped. To be fair, the headscarf we wore was tiny and it was always on our necks. And very often, as it got very cold in Kurdistan, some of us thought it wasn't a bad idea, because by that stage we all had short hair, very short hair, cropped hair, I would say. The main, if you like, gift that we had for the peasants was the clinic. The clinic played a very important role. We had two doctors, both Mastura was a medic, but also we had a visiting doctor who stayed, and he left, but another doctor came. So most of the times there were two doctors in this clinic. Their main purpose, and one of their main purposes, was to operate on Peshmergas who came with very severe injuries, bleeding, whatever, caused by bombs, by gunshots. But the clinic's daily routine was to look after the peasants, and villagers came from all that area, probably 20 kilometers around the area, to this clinic to seek medical help. And it really did, if you like, improve the condition, the relationship with the peasants. In the second base I stayed, it was vital. We wouldn't have survived in that mountainous village at -20 during winter if it wasn't for the medics who were staying in our base, because their role was to dispense drugs, medication to peasants, but also look after the children who were ill, the women. The clinic in Basha had the advantage that we had a woman doctor. And this increased our, if you like, field of opportunities. She ran a field hospital, so she used to travel on a jeep to further areas of Kurdistan where a school or a local building was taken over to allow her to practice medicine. On one occasion, when I went with her, a queue was formed for quite a long distance around the village by neighboring villages who'd sent their peasants to be cured by this doctor. And obviously they weren't supporters of the Fada'i movement, but the fact that we had the flag, we had the leaflets and so on, did make the difference. The routine was very much similar to what others who have written about the, if you like, the Khane Timi, the team houses during the pre-revolutionary era will tell you, because the timetable was set by the very people who had survived that era. So people got up very early, they had the exercise, there was a hill near us, and the more energetic would climb up the hill, run up the hill and back down. Most of the mornings was taken up by, after breakfast and cleaning, was taken up by meetings and study. So there were many groups there. So you had the subcommittee of the Tehran Workers' Committee meetings there in order for Nastaran, for example, to come from Tehran, to have a discussion there and to move back, to go back with whatever plans were there. There was rotas, everything was under rotas. So I believe that's also upon 18 positions. So you had cooking, cleaning rotas, you had a guard duty rota. We were constantly under threat of being attacked by revolutionary guards. So we had 24 hours, 7 days a week guard rota. And in this, both men and women, you just had to do it. You didn't have much choice on that. The important event of, if there were military exercises or what I would call long walks between people who discussed politics but had these long walks, that took part about mid to late afternoon. And our main meal was at lunchtime, but the evening meal was mainly bread and cheese, nothing else. After the meetings, we had 2 types of events, either a mass political meeting where we had question and answer with the Central Committee, not very brilliant, I can assure you, partly because the confusions about lack of strategy, lack of tactics that Siyahkal referred to briefly continued. So on the one hand, the emphasis was on working with the working class, removing ourselves from military operations. At the same time, the idea had cropped up about Juhahai Razmi, which was a kind of guerrilla activity in Tehran and other major cities, which cost the lives of other people. For example, it is during this period that an attack took place against the Japanese embassy in Tehran. Khomeini had said Japan's capitalism is okay because it's Eastern capitalism. It wasn't a bad idea to attack Japanese resources, but on the other hand, it was a disastrous, suicidal, and completely irrational type of activity to go that way. The other activity in the evenings was Jole. Jole was very important, not just to the Fada'i, but to all political organizations in the Iranian, in the area. You went with jeeps to a major city, Bane, Miane, one of the cities, Kurdish cities, late at night, distributed leaflets, shouted some slogans, and as soon as the pastors arrived, you took the jeep and you rushed back. There was a lot of debate about whether women should participate in this, and eventually, I suppose you could say women won the argument and they were allowed to do so. The arguments against women participating in this had a lot to do with what was considered to be repercussions should a woman be arrested during such an event. The expectation was that the treatment she would get would be far worse than a man, and it was correct not to do that. I have said that quite a lot of women traveled between Kurdistan and Tehran. I would argue that quite a lot of them were in positions of power in the organizations. They had authorities, they had positions, and therefore you couldn't say there was discrimination against them. Having said that, I would also want to emphasize that it wasn't the fact that they held a gun that made them equal. I argue this in particular because there's a lot of illusions about Syria, Turkey, everywhere else, where the simple fact that a Peshmerga has a woman has a gun makes them equals. That's not true. We saw discrimination. I saw discrimination against younger Peshmerga women who were of Kurdish peasant origin and who weren't in positions of authority. What gave the women I talked about, Nastaran, Nasture, Fatih to extent, Zahra Behkish, for those who don't know her, what gave them authority was the fact that they were in positions of authority in Tehran, regarding the paper in the Central Committee, and therefore Peshmergas in general held them in high esteem if you like, because they were doing, they were important people. Last, I just want to briefly talk about the whole situation in terms of nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, and the left in that region. It was a situation of convenience. It was convenient for the Kurdish peasants and the Kurdish population to host the left, and that allowed these bases to exist. But it couldn't be a long-term solution. As we were there already, helicopter gunships over our heads, especially in the second base I was, which was a mountainous region, a far more dangerous region. You couldn't really sleep at night without hearing the attacks on neighboring villages, neighboring areas, and this was only a very short-term period. And the problems of lack of program, lack of tactic became very serious, partly because in many ways, minority Fada'i was a coalition of all those who opposed majority without agreeing exactly what they wanted to do themselves. So the common enemy had made them into a single force. But even in Kurdistan, it was very clear that, for example, opinions about the Soviet Union were very divided. There were those, even on the Central Committee, who openly talked of a non-capitalist road to development. The problem with Soviet policy apparently wasn't the fact that Tudeh existed, that it called for a peaceful road to socialism and so on. The problem was if the heavy industry in Iran could be built with the help of the socialist camp, but not with the Tudeh party involved in it. So it really was a very, not just Jazani, but I would say almost a Tudeh position, while there were those who completely opposed the socialist camp. The fact that there were so many splits afterwards within this group of minority was inevitable, because once you have such diverse opinions, only united in their opposition to majority and their correct position, I still maintain that critical support for the Islamic Republic would be a historic mistake. That wasn't enough to maintain a coherent organization. So I finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasemin. We have one question, and I just want to mention that Professor Abrahamian is in the room, and now we have him as a panelist. So if you want to answer that question, you're also welcome to do so. The question, I think, the reason I'm bringing up Irvan's name is that he addressed that question in the other seminar in Persian. The question is to any of the panelists, could you please offer an assessment of the role of the Fada'is in the erosion of the Shah's power?
Can I say a few words?
Yeah, go ahead.
Nobody else wants to do that. Thank you. It's a good question. And I think it's well worded as well, erosion of the Shah's power, because from the moment in which the Fada'i movement emerges in the months following Siyahkal, I would say it is engaged in this very unbalanced struggle with the Shah's regime, and there are various ways in which the Fada'is are repressed. They pick up the pieces again. They start being active again, and of course the press controlled by SAVAK, the secret police, covers them a lot. There's a lot of press coverage produced by SAVAK, famous media appearances by Paris Sabeti, the head of the SAVAK internal operations. And progressively, and I think Ali Rahnama mentions this as well in his new book, there is a wave of sympathy which emerges, also based on the fact that these were, there was also this martyrdom streak amongst the Fada'is, and of course amongst the various wings of the Mujahideen that other groups didn't have. You didn't have National Front martyrs or liberation movement martyrs, and actually martyrs within the Khomeinist faction were actually far fewer and far more prominent than these radical groups. So this certainly, in my view, dented the views of certain parts of society vis-a-vis the Shah, particularly, for example, university communities. And we see that from in the 70s, there's an influx of university students Iranian university students in the West. And many of them receive scholarships from the Shah, but they're not very loyal to the Shah. They start engaging in considerable opposition activity, fueled also by the emergence of this Fada'i myth. So the Fada'is by themselves could not have really brought the Shah down. I don't think this organization had the capacity to either run a revolution or engage in a successful form of urban struggle. We shouldn't forget this. It had its limits, but it did take a part, in my view, in as you say, the erosion of societal support for the Shah, particularly in the way in which the heavy-handed way in which it was repressed, and the way in which I think much of the propaganda caused by the regime had a boomerang effect and came to weaken its position rather than strengthen it.
So Yasamin, you have your hands up. Do you want to add to?
Just very briefly, I think Silver said, he said most of what I would have said. All I would add is that this whole period of 1953 to 71 was a period where very little was happening. Right? Tudeh was either in exile, in prison, or had changed sides. So you even had Tudeh people who held government positions, or quite a lot of Tudeh people, ex-Tudeh people, had joined commerce, finance, industries. They were quite involved or part of the Shah's system. It doesn't mean they didn't do any work, because I assume they were, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were still contributing financially, maybe to the party or listening to Radio Moscow or something. But this wasn't a situation that would have led to a change in the government in Iran. I think what did change was, for all its, if you like, Roger Debray style talk, was Amir Parviz Pouyan or Masoud Ahmadzadeh. They changed the way people thought about the government. It did say survival is not an option. We are not, you can't just survive. You can't just live your life as businessmen, as some of them as ministers of the Shah's regime. You really have to change this situation. And I think that did make a difference. I do realize that the 6 months life of a Fada'i wasn't exactly anything you can recommend to anybody, and wasn't good, not politically. It wasn't a very intelligent way of fighting the Shah's regime. But that doesn't change the fact that I think, in fact, if I understood correctly, Professor Abrahamian was relating to this. that whole possibility of change came with people taking quite radical positions for the time. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions in the QA box. So my suggestion is that to rerun the video that we had from Professor Abrahamian at the beginning, and we had the technical problem. So with that, I would, if there's any other question.
Thank you for inviting me to open this seminar. I'm not really qualified to do this task, mainly because I haven't really studied anything new on the Fada'i for some 30 years. So I have no new research or new information about the Fada'i to offer to the seminar. So instead of trying to offer something new information, what I'll try to do is basically provide a historian's look at the significance of the Fada'i. Here I'm using the word significance not in terms of importance. Importance is somewhat different. Significance is more in what it signifies about Iran and Iranian history, especially at that time. The question of importance is a different issue. Clearly, the present regime has tried to brush out the Fada'i from the revolution in some way that some people in after 1917 tried to brush certain people out of 1917 and made them into non-persons. So the modern regime in Iran has tried to eliminate or disappear the Fada'i from the revolution. But this is a different issue I don't really want to focus on. I want to focus on what the significance of the emergence of the Fada'i was towards Iranian history. In looking back at, now it's 50 years, there are three major issues one should keep in mind for a historian looking back. First, the 50 years gives us a hindsight. We know what happened after 79, but of course people in the 70s up to 79 didn't know what was going to happen after the revolution. So there's often a lot of judgment that we can use after 50 years later to project back. So we have to be aware that people at that period had very different knowledge, and their mood was very different. Secondly, we've had in more recent years opening up of secret documents that people at that time did not have, and therefore we can actually be more, you can say, historical at looking at what was happening at the time when activists and people dealing in day-to-day politics of the 1970s were not privileged of having that information. Third, time gives us the opportunity to be more detached from the time and less judgmental in looking at what was happening and trying to evaluate whether this person was right or wrong. We should basically look at it more objectively from a distance. So we have those, you can say, three advantages at looking back 50 years. But there is also one problem when a historian looks back. It's often said the past is a foreign country, and 50 years actually is almost an eternity when the the dominant discourse of the time was very different. So how we think in 2021 is very different how people thought in the early 70s, late 60s. This gives us almost a cultural gap, and we have to be careful that when we try to analyze what was happening at that time, don't project our own values of much later to the discourse of that period. We have to basically take that context of the period as it was, and then later on take be more distance and look at it from objectively. So these problems exist in any type of history. They still especially exist in dealing with something very dynamic, very controversial, very, you could say, heroic and tragic about the Fada'i. Now, the attack on the Siyahkal on March 8, 1971, really launched what became well known as the armed struggle or the guerrilla movement in Iran. Although its open activities of the armed struggle started then, its gestation really goes back to 1953 and the coup. The coup began a period of intense oppression, outlawing of political parties, banning of unions, independent organizations, use of military courts to deal with political dissent, resort to massive torture in prison, use of military, use of basic executions, mass executions of opponents, and willingness to fire on armed protesters in the streets. This oppression became even more blatant in the early 1960s, when the National Front tried to have large rallies, and it succeeded actually in rallying large numbers of people in Tehran. And then, of course, in 1963, June 63, there were mass violence in the streets. And this was met with massive firepower. So the massive oppression and the stifling atmosphere after 53 really raised the question among the younger generation, especially a younger generation who had participated in the politics before 53, to raise the question, what is to be done? Clearly, the previous strategy for political struggle, the strategy of political parties, trade unions, professional associations, mass meetings, could no longer work, mainly because of the oppression and the willingness of the regime to use massive force. The only answer for many was to turn away from political struggle to that of armed struggle. Not surprisingly, almost all the founders of the many guerrilla movements that began were younger members of either the Tudeh party, the National Front, or the Nashat Azadi. Radicals disillusioned by the strategy of political struggle and attracted by the notion of armed struggle, they turned to thinking and toying with the idea of guerrilla warfare. The old political struggle seemed to have reached a cul-de-sac, and armed struggle seemed to appear to open the way for a new dawn. The discourse of the armed struggle became increasingly prominent in the late 60s and early 70s. This was, of course, helped by what was happening internationally. You had the Maoist victory in China, Viet Minh victory in Vietnam, the FLN war of independence in Algeria, and most pertinent of all, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and the emergence of guerrilla insurgencies throughout South America in the 60s. So here you have both the context, Iranian context of the cul-de-sac of the political struggle and the international context of the appeal of guerrilla warfare, the armed struggle. When the ruling regime had closed off basically all channels, it seemed that political struggle, the armed struggle, was the only alternative. And this is actually clear in Che Guevara's writings in 1961 in his book, Guerrilla Warfare. He says, when the ruling regime has closed off all channels of political reform, then it becomes incumbent on revolutionists to resort to armed struggle. He adds, it must always be kept in mind there is a necessary minimum without which the establishment and consolidation of the guerrilla center is not practical. Where a regime has come into power through some form of popular vote, fraudulent or not, maintains at least some semblance of constitutional legality, the guerrilla outbreak cannot be promoted since the possibility of peaceful struggle has not yet been exhausted. And here he is making it clear, it's only when it's clear that there is no possibility of a political struggle that one can then talk about armed struggle. And clearly in Iran, at that time, it was quite clear to anyone that the political struggle was not possible because there was no room, and therefore the only choice seemed to be the resort to armed struggle. So in many ways, the Shah's Iran met Che's prerequisite that the regime was based on the fraud of 1953 and the closing of all possibilities of peaceful reform. Much debate in the 1960s between the political versus armed struggle was basically then the main discourse of the time. And in this debate between the two, the armed struggle clearly won out because the 53 had struck such a mortal blow against the traditional approach, which in Iran, the traditional approach had been actually through the political struggle, organizational struggle, demonstrations, strikes, and forming of organizations. The 1953 coup not only struck a mortal blow on the concept of political struggle, it also actually undermined the whole concept of constitutionalism and individual rights. If you look at the politics of Iran from really the Mashrutiyat till 53, what was often stressed as legitimacy was that of the Mashrutiyat and of individual rights. Mossadegh, the National Front, and much of the political figures of the 1940s and 50s spoke the language of the 1906 revolution, the language of Mashrutiyat and individual rights. Mossadegh, of course, is well known for nationalization of the oil industry, but equally well known at that time, he was the champion of the Constitution and a veteran of the Constitution. And we often, again, because of the discourse of the time, we forget that in this period before 53, the idea of rights, individual rights, was very much part of political discourse, which then disappeared more in the 1960s and 70s, mainly because of 53. Just to give you an example, if you look at the program of the Tudeh party right after it was formed, right at the top of the program, on actually clause 2 of the program, it says, مبارز در راه استقرار رژیم دموکراسی و تامین کلیه حقوق فردی و اجتماعی از قبیل آزادی زبان، نطق، قلم، عقیده و اجتماعات. Here you find basically these are ideas that actually come from the Enlightenment and the notion that each individual in nature has the natural rights of equality, liberty, and these basic rights. These were, in fact, very much a part of the political discourse of the time. But after the coup, they basically were submerged by larger, broader discourses. On the left, we talk about these ideas became known, mistakenly known as bourgeois rights, as if individual rights were not crucial to Marx and Engels. For Marx and Engels, social rights were important, but individual rights were even more important. Social rights actually protected individual rights. But in the atmosphere of the Shah's regime, these issues became submerged in the notion that revolution would solve all problems, that Islam was the solution, and you find even writers like Shariati denouncing the Enlightenment and individual rights as part of Gharb-zadegi that should be rejected. So you have a very different discourse as a result of the casualty of the 53 coup and the establishment of the Shah's dictatorship. So the debate, you can say the discourse became very much dominated by that of the armed struggle, and the political struggle actually was submerged. Even though, even at that time, there were people who continued to talk about political struggle. And ironically, towards the end, you find that, in fact, many of the guerrilla groups actually resorted back to political struggle, but I won't get into that. The question then I want to end up is, what was the revolution? Was it a success of political struggle or armed struggle? Ironically, it was from neither. This was the big surprise, you can say. What happened eventually was not the success of organizational political struggle, nor of a guerrilla struggle, although both played a role. The surprising thing was the Iranian Revolution eventually was much more in the style of the anarchist concept of revolution in the 19th century. Even though Iran didn't have any anarchists and there was no anarchist tradition, but the anarchist concept of revolution in the 19th century was that if millions of people individually, spontaneously, without organization, were willing to strike, willing to protest, the regime could come down, would come down. This had never happened elsewhere, but it did happen in Iran eventually in 1979, because once you look at actually what happened in 79, it wasn't so much organizations. Even the clergy didn't have a nationwide organization. There were no political parties that could organize massive demonstrations or strikes. It was much more grassroots level, individuals on a large scale acting in a concerted manner against the regime that the Shah must go. So it was, the success was not attributed to any one political organization or association or you can say a political organized group, but in fact to a massive movement, nationwide movement dispersed throughout the country. There's one document that has actually come out recently when the Americans were thinking of having a coup. At that time, they thought the army was still functioning. The pertinent answer from the embassy was, okay, the Iranian army can carry out a coup. They can take over, let's say, the ministries. They can take over the oil fields, the refinery. But how are they going to get the whole country back to work since the whole country is in a state of general strike? And that general strike wasn't organized by any centralized organization. It was because so many people wanted to get rid of the Shah. And the slogan was, of course, we won't go back to work until the Shah leaves. And this basically leaves the answer that the regime eventually collapsed, not so much because of any one organization or even because of the clergy or it was basically because the regime had no legitimacy. Very few people believed that this had any authority, legitimate authority. And this legitimacy was lost really in 1953 because of a foreign planned coup. And therefore, the regime was seen as a puppet of the imperial powers. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions. One question is, how did the United States react to the emergence of the Fada'i? Did they feel compelled to crack down on leftists because of the Cold War? Siyavush, Yasamir, Rasmus, Arash, any of you want to answer?
I'll try very briefly, then others can finish it. I think the United States was very much consumed by the Cold War. And even though the Fada'i were not, at that stage anyway, aligned with the Soviet Union, they had strong criticisms of the Soviet Union, this was considered direct. We have the memoirs of Heiser, General Heiser, who in the crucial transfer days, the 10 days after which the Shah had left, the revolution hadn't yet happened, we have his memoirs and the notes that he wrote to the Carter administration, and their recommendations to military forces and everybody else in Iran was not to go for a military coup to revive the Shah's rule, but to leave that option if there was any risk of the left taking power. I don't think there was a left. I've always argued there wasn't a question of dual power or a risk of the left. But clearly the United States thought it was legitimate to use another coup like 1953 if there was a risk of the left taking power. During the Shah's time itself, we have to remember that the clergy could still work within mosques. Khomeini was in exile, he wasn't killed. Because of the nature of the Fada'i movement, partly their own options as well, I'm not just blaming the Shah's regime here, they were killed. A generation, 360 Fada'i members died before the revolution. So the way the Shah's regime, as the governments that followed CIA diktat and everything, its secret police was set up by the CIA. The way it reacted to the left was very different to the way it reacted to religious opposition. I leave it to others.
If there is not,
I'm sorry, I just
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll because there's a couple of questions that I could actually link, and since my own research is also on the sort of Cold War dimensions of the sort of Iranian and Arab leftist movements at the time, I'll very briefly try to answer a couple of the questions, in a way that they would be related. So there's also a question about whether Fada'ians had connections with other groups. Yasmin already mentioned that they had links with the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, the leading Palestinian group, Marxist-Leninist Palestinian group that continues to be, it's usually considered to be like the second biggest after Fatah inside the PLO, not counting Hamas and others, and the Zofari revolutions in Oman. And as for the relations with the Soviet Union, Rahnama's book actually does discuss a rumor or an accusation against Fada'is at the time, the time being 1975-76, that some elements of the Fada'iyan had tried to contact the Soviet Union and get support from it, and the Shah's regime had sort of attacked them for this, but there was not evidence on this. So the Cold War context, a couple of points that I've briefly mentioned. So at the time, the British press and the American right-wing press, but the British press was sort of more important even in a way, dedicated quite a bit of a space to attacking the Fada'is as terrorists, and they did so in the language of Cold War, of communist terrorists, and of the Shah as a sort of someone who was holding the fort against these terrorist communists. And very much this was an important part of, if you were the global intellectual debates, global intellectual and political debates around communism in general. So the defense of Shah, which was obviously a tyrant, obviously an anti-democrat, was couched in anti-communist terms, and it was said that he's fighting these terrorist communists, as the word was used. And it's this becomes important because, of course, as sympathies for socialism and the left increased in many Western countries, including the US and the UK, this line of attack became much less effective. And in the British press at the time, you had sort of lords, high-ranking members of the establishment with lucrative financial relations with the Shah who would publish these things, and academics on the left who would counter them. People like Fred Halliday, for example, which was personally attacked by Shah later. Fred Halliday was personally attacked by Shah precisely because of this. So I think this is an important part of, if you will, global political history of the time. And I think, as Rahnama also explained in the book, the Shah had a big difficulty in explaining, and he became very conspiratorial in his thinking of why is it that in the New York Times they don't understand that I'm fighting this, terrorist communist. Doesn't the U.S. doesn't understand that this is the Cold War? And he, he had these ideas that some foreign sources control the press in the UK and the US, which he saw as very important, and they're against him. So, which also fits well with some of the nativist turn that he had taken there. So this is important. And the second thing I'd mention is that in the thinking around, there was an active effort. Now, very recent new documents show, one has to be careful here, because I want to encourage the conspiratorial thinking that does exist among the monarchists and some others, but there was a constant effort on sort of some Islamist revolutionaries to tell the United States, as you got closer to the revolution, of what people in their memoirs, people like Ibrahim Yazdi, have called diplomatie-e-inqilab. And diplomatie-e-inqilab, the revolution's diplomacy, was to tell the United States that in no uncertain terms, look, whatever you think about Ayatollah Khomeini and our movement, we're not communists, and we want to be very clear about this. And this was very important in decision-making on the United States' part. As we see that President Carter, for example, writes in his diary at the time that like January 1979, right before the revolution, he writes, well, Shah is going to go, but if Iran is going to be a genuinely non-aligned country, i.e. not communist, maybe that's not such a big news, which was very important, of course, because had there been a serious chance that that Iran would go communist or join the other camp, as many had hoped, obviously the calculations would have changed very much. So I think this Cold War context really did affect all sides. And last but not least, I think as Yasemin mentioned that herself, it's interesting, the question of the relationship that the Fada'is and other parts of the left had toward the socialist camp. Frankly, some of the historiography since then misstates this reality. For example, the Fada'is or others are portrayed as some sort of third worldists who had a genuine they believe that, well, we are against Soviet socialism or Chinese socialism because we are against the superpowers, and we have our own ways. And well, they were big admirers of Lenin, big admirers of Mao, often big admirers of Stalin. So there wasn't a theoretical question that they're portrayed as new left sometimes, and they were new in some ways. But there's no evidence that the main thinkers of the Fada'is at the time and the main trends of thinking were sort of questioning, if you will, the foundations of these ideas, unlike what some historiography claims at parts, with little basis, in my opinion. The critique that they had of the Soviet Union was either a Maoist critique or a critique of to the party, or a critique that they were not being revolutionary enough. But this was also in a lot of tension, not worked out, because part of the whole thing was that we don't do a lot of theoretical work, we need to act. And this led to a lot of contradictions later on, because it wasn't clear what exactly is the critical Soviet Union. Do we see the Soviet Union and the United States as the same? Are we neutral then in the Cold War? Which obviously wasn't the case, because they supported other pro-Soviet communist regimes in Vietnam and in Cuba 100%. And the regimes in Cuba and Vietnam were in no doubt about whether they consider Soviet Union socialist or not. So I think it's important to put that period and the takes on Fada'i on the Cold War and on its three poles, if you will, China, Soviet Union, and US, in clear perspective, and not to project what we want, which, as I say, sometimes has been done.
So there's a question.
Sorry, Gudas, can I very briefly on this point?
Okay.
I don't know much about the American documents. I think they were mentioned in these two answers. I'll very briefly say what the British felt about the rise of the Fada'is, because that's interesting as well. And interestingly, the very rise of the Fada'is, the Siyahkal incident and what happened in the following year or so, appear in specific dossiers by the British Embassy in Tehran called Terrorism in Iran. So first and foremost, they were labeled firmly in the terrorist camp. This was terrorist operations, according to the British Embassy in Tehran and the diplomatic reporting. Then the label of Maoist stuck for a while to what they call the Siyahkal gang. But this was not because the Siyahkal gang was Maoist. I don't think Maoism is a very strong current in the early Fada'i writings in particular, but because they couldn't stick anything else. It felt tough to label them as pro-Soviet or supported by the Soviets, because the Soviets were improving relations with the Shah, and it didn't make sense for the Soviets to start supporting something which emerged out of the Siyahkal jungles when the Tudeh party was the main sort of Soviet conduit for political influence operating in Eastern Europe. And of course, Siyahkal was based in the forest, right? So they rather clumsily reached the point that this had to be a Maoist organization. And this remained for a while, but then it faded from circulation. But what is interesting is that at some point, they reached the conclusion that the Fada'is are not connected to any foreign government. And the way they reached this conclusion is because of all the bank robberies that the Fada'is were doing. And they associated the Fada'is to a set of bank robberies, and they got to the conclusion that the only reason for this bank robbery is that there's no foreign funding or no embassy funding from Tehran. And from then onwards, they started sort of gaining this idea that this is a sort of an independent Marxist organization which is operating.
There's a question that Yasamin has raised to answer. It's would you please offer an assessment of the role of Fada'iyan as the opposition of Islamic Republic now?
I would say not a very strong opposition. I mean, it depends what you mean by opposition. I would say that the divisions in the Fada'i, the fact that large chunks of it supported critically the Islamic Republic, but supported the Islamic Republic, but then sections of it didn't, has led to a situation where we can't really consider them as a viable opposition to the Islamic Republic. If you look at the exile groups, I would divide them into two categories. Those who, in despair of the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, which they thought would be in days, weeks, has lasted 42 years and hasn't happened, have become what I would call regime change supporters. They could easily go with Trump now. This is exiles, not real members or supporters of the organization, but the despair of exile, the fact that they're so separate from reality inside Iran, has led to a situation where these people have really, you can't call them anything but regime change supporters. And then there are those who have played as allies of the reformist faction. And I think, in my opinion, they're also discredited amongst the young generation in Iran that doesn't see any hope in the factions of the Islamic Republic. So my answer would be there isn't a viable opposition by any part of the Fada'i to the current regime. There are those who do their best, but I would sum it up like that.
So there's another question. It says, can we say that despite of the Siyahkal movement was not correct with today's criteria and facts, but at least it brought and spread the left ideas in a closed and religious society in the Middle East? Anybody wants to answer that?
I was actually going to say very briefly on the last question something. May I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that again, I think one of the most important achievements of different Fada'is throughout these years, again, as someone born in 1988 who grew up, the internet was coming, so you could go and read all these organizations. Output was that, a lot of them kept thinking about Marxism and socialism and kept really the flame alive of these ideas through very hard times, frankly, because now it's the age of sort of Bernie Sanders and the rise of Corbyn Britain and many others. But when I grew up in the early 2000s, to be a socialist was often considered, you were attacked very hardly on all sides. You had all these sort of ex-leftists, especially, who were like, I can't believe, you're still talking about socialism. And a lot of these different Fada'i organizations kept thinking and updating different ideas. And of course, the fact that the Fada'i majority gave critical support to the Islamic Republic, that ended, in the mid-'80s after the Islamic Republic attacked them and killed or imprisoned a lot of them. Now, of course, when the reformist movement arose, some sections of the Tudeh party or the supporters of the Tudeh party and Fada'iyan gave some support to some elements in the reformist movement, but really wasn't the same thing as supporting the regime. So I think all different. So basically, I think the different organizations abroad, by the continued intellectual production and political production that they had, programmatic productions, publishing and translating ideas of other leftist organizations, transferring the news of the workers' struggles in Iran to these other organizations around the world, like the great work that Yasmin herself has done throughout all these years, did some valuable contribution in opposition to the regime. But of course, the reality is that, of course, the organized opposition to the Islamic Republic and a real alternative to it is something that we have all collectively sort of failed to build, and that's a problem. But I think over a long historical view, this work that the Fada'is and others did in exile is something that should be appreciated.
Did anybody else want to address any of the questions? If not, I think we can close the event and appreciate participants, the panelists who accepted invitation to attend, and thank you very much for very, I guess, comprehensive overview of the Fada'i movement in 50 years. And I hope that we can continue this conversation in other settings. Appreciate all for attending and good comments, and thank you for your gracious support of the event. Thank you.